Thank you so much for having me. I'm coming to you from Toronto, from the part of Toronto that was underwater at the time of the Toronto Purchase and is therefore unceded territory, the land of the Mississaugas of the Credit, part of the Dish with One Spoon Treaty Wampum territory, and Three Fires territory. So thanks for the chance to come and meet with you here today. Um, I'm just going to start sharing my screen here to give you some images to look at while I'm chatting with you. I'm just going to get this set up here. Play. Great. Yeah. So, I mean, here we are, right? We find ourselves in the middle of the most revolutionary times. Revolution is not a one-time event, it is a process. And we are absolutely in a period of profound change and reorganization of our society and our world. And so, in thinking about what wellness, what care, what healing justice needs to look like in the current moment in our work, in our organizing, in all of the ways that we come to being in this world, we really need to be thinking about futurity and thinking about the kinds of changes that are imminent, these emergent changes that are pressing and that are coming up. I made this drawing a couple of years ago, maybe 6 years ago, and I had been asked by a friend who was making, of all things, a tarot deck about disability justice if I would draw a card. If I would draw one of the cards, and I don't know much about tarot or about that whole world, but I was intrigued with the idea of drawing, and the card that they had assigned to me was the death card, which, from what I understand about tarot, is a pretty significant card to get. And because this was connected to disability justice, and in particular to people's experience of cancer and the cancer industry was the focus of this, I chose to draw this image of purple cone flowers, of this healing plant that is healing medicine, that was going through a very natural stage of life cycles. So this idea that all living things, and in this case, living plants, germinate, grow, blossom, take to seed, decay and die, but then nourish the soil beneath them and germinate the future generations and future plants. And to think about death in that way, to think about how we could have good deaths, to think about the ways that we could embrace these kinds of natural life cycles as a way of accepting them and as a way of embracing them and as a way of understanding that our work is part of our ancestors' work and is part of the work of our great-grandchildren, and that as we work to try to change society, this is what we're talking about when we learn from Indigenous knowledge keepers who tell us about 7 generations, 3 behind ours and 3 ahead. This idea that we are always in a cycle of germinating, growing, blossoming, seeding, dying, decaying, nourishing, and germinating the next generation. So anyways, I drew this drawing, and I mean, it could have just ended there, but then I started doing some research into systems thinking, and I teach systems thinking at the BAM Center, and systems thinking is this, just really this way of understanding the complexity of our current world, how change happens, what the processes of change need to look like, and how systems function in order to understand what levers to pull in order to make the kinds of changes happen in our world that we need to happen, say, to eradicate poverty or to end anti-Black racism. If you can understand and map a system and understand how a system is functioning, you can maybe have a chance of influencing it and potentially changing it. So when we study systems theory, one of the things that we learn about is this idea of what's called a panarchy cycle, which basically just says that every single system goes through a life cycle. And it's the same life cycle that I drew in that drawing for this tarot deck without even realizing it. But every system goes through a period of growth and expansion. You know, and you can imagine a forest with trees growing taller and taller and taller, and canopies getting wider and wider and wider, and vines growing up the bottom, and all sorts of plants and vegetation and life taking place and flourishing. And it grows and becomes more and more complex. And then inevitably it becomes larger than it can sustain, right? And so the tree canopy is now taking up so much of the sunlight that it's not reaching the plants at the bottom. And there starts to be a period of a collapse. And we go through a period of collapse. Sometimes in forests, it might be a forest fire, you know, that is created as a result of this. But there's a period of collapse. And in this period of collapse, it is a fertile period where we plant seeds for what is the reorganization period, or the reimagination, or the beginning of what is next. The next forest that is going to grow in the ashes, the next plant that is going to wiggle its way up from the soil, the next thing that is going to grow next. So all systems go through life cycles of growth, expansion, collapse, and reorganization. And they do it over and over and over and over again. And sometimes there are multiple systems, you know, that are all at play and that are at different points in the life cycle, but they go through these life cycles of change. So just to go back to this drawing, systems go through a period of growth and expansion, rapid growth and expansion. They go through periods of collapse, you know, decay, and they go through periods of rapid reorganization, and then another period of growth and expansion. Why am I talking about this, right? Well, because if we can understand this as a natural process, we can understand this current revolutionary moment that we find ourselves in. We are in a revolutionary moment. So this is actually an image of plants growing in the ashes of the Australian forest fires that happened in the beginning of 2020. So you'll remember we began this year like no other years, this year that has challenged us in all of the ways. We began this year with an entire continent on fire because of climate change. Right? And because of white supremacy, because of course, white supremacy prevented indigenous forest management practices from being followed, which resulted in the expansive burning that we saw that would have otherwise been mitigated if we had listened to indigenous knowledge keepers. But anyways, this image shows what has happened in a period of collapse. In a period of collapse, there is opportunity for new life to germinate and grow, for new things to spring from the ashes, for new possibilities. Now there is suddenly sunlight. Now the forest floor is suddenly clear. Now the forest floor is nourished with all of the decayed material. And now it is fertile ground for some potential growth, right? So as we imagine 2020 as this period of collapse, it is a period of collapse. You know, we can recognize that this is a fertile moment for change making and for improving the conditions of all living beings on Turtle Island and Inuit Nunavut, and all living beings on the planet, right? So as we move through this year like no other, it can feel as if we are living in a speculative fiction novel. I mean, in many ways, it really does seem like, what is fiction anymore? They have found life on Venus. I mean, there are unusual things happening every single month. Octavia Butler, a Black speculative fiction writer, brilliant author, wrote a lot of books about this current time period. So she was writing in the 90s. She was writing for decades, but in the 90s she famously wrote Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talent, that are set in a very 2020 like moment. And it's sort of a post-apocalyptic story that tells of a society in the middle of a collapse. And so Octavia was writing this speculative fiction novel wherein Black, Indigenous, racialized, largely disabled folks are leading us to a freedom where we actually all get to make it. And in this storyline, she's talking about systems change. She's talking about collapse. She's talking about life on the brink. And one of the things that happens in the storyline is that the main character, a Black disabled young woman named Laura Nolamina, she starts writing down things that she knows to be true, and she calls them Earthseed, book of the living, and she writes them all down in this book. And one of the things that she says famously is, all that you touch, you change. All that you change changes you. The only lasting truth is change. And she, later on says that it's important for us to touch change. So Walida Imarisha, who's an author and a scholar who writes a lot about speculative fiction, she says that all activism is speculative fiction, all of it, because it's daring to dream that another world is possible. It's daring to imagine that another world is possible. So as activists, as advocates, as people who are trying to change the world, we are engaging in acts of speculative fiction. So no wonder in this year, like no other, we find ourselves in the middle of this revolutionary moment. We wake up and it is as if we are living in a speculative fiction novel, because all activism is speculative fiction, and activism is around us, breathing around us in every moment of our days. So the real cry that has shaped a lot of 2020 began, of course, with the COVID-19 pandemic outbreak and then the shutdowns. We saw a system in collapse when COVID emerged, right? So we saw at first the beginning of an economic collapse, or not the beginning, the continuation of an economic collapse, because we've been in a period of late capitalism and late capital for a while, but we saw unsustainable solutions to trying to save capitalism as it tried to die. We saw in May them putting $1 trillion a day into the stock market just to sustain it, completely unsustainable, right? Just to save this dying system, rather than recognizing the fertile potential of the change that we are currently going through. I heard a lot of people ask this question, okay, COVID-19 is really highlighting some of the issues in our society. And so when we say go back to normal, we don't actually want to go back to the way that things were, because things were actually significantly bad. So I know that we know this, but I'm saying, like, Cosmo magazine was saying that, like the mainstream was saying, hey, we don't actually want to go back to the way that things were, because they were not working for so many of us. And so people were being asked this question: into what kind of world do you want to emerge from COVID? Right? And I do a lot of media, and I was asked that a lot, and people were asking that question. And I think what the resounding call that I heard through the spring and early part of the summer was, we were going to emerge into a world that was radically recentered around care. So when the shutdowns first began, we saw a lot of people turning to mutual aid. And mutual aid strategies grow out of disability communities, in particular, racialized Black and Indigenous disabled communities, Latinx communities. We saw folks like Leah Lakshmi, Piepsina Samarasina, Rebel Stacey Black, Stacey Melbourne, putting together mutual aid support resources, and people figuring out ways to pod map and to develop these community circles where we were going to take care of each other. And this idea, this rallying cry from disability justice, we take care of each other, became this centering idea of how we were going to emerge from COVID. We were going to emerge as a community that took and that continued to take care of each other. And then all hell broke loose. The police killed George Floyd. The police were involved in the death of Regis Korchinski-Paquette. The police killed Chantel Moore. We saw this string of deaths at the hands of the police that brought people into a very precarious situation where they had to decide between keeping their loved ones safe and keeping themselves safe, and wanting to take to the streets to cry out against this injustice, right? And so many of us were like, do I go to the protest? Do I not? Is a mask enough? How do I respond to this violence? outside of our traditional ways of organizing. Maybe a rally isn't the only way that we can rise up against this. What does it need to look like? So we started thinking about we take care of each other in a new way. We started thinking about how we would take care of each other in the streets, how we would take care of each other through doing activisms from our beds, from our homes, activism that involved disabled people, that involved mad people, that involved the people who were centrally being the ones being killed by the police. It's disabled, deaf and mad, Black and Indigenous people largely who are being killed by the police. So this cry, we take care of each other, starts to take on a bit of a different shape and a bit of a different meaning. And then people started calling for a defunding of the police and an abolishing of the police. And then, you know, in the summer, they shot Jacob Blake 7 times in his back. And people started saying, you know what, actually, we need to abolish this entire situation. And we may not know exactly where we are going to go to outside of this current reality, but we know we can come up with something better than shooting someone 7 times in the back as they're walking away, right? So people started to take up this cry of abolishing the police and carceral system, abolishing the prison industrial complex. So now we take care of each other means we take care of all of the people in our communities. We're not disenfranchising and disappearing people from our communities for things that are related to fraud or money or drugs or any of the things that we get criminalized for. Instead, now we take care of each other is about abolition. And then the verdict comes in the Breonna Taylor case. And it's actually not the Breonna Taylor case, because Breonna Taylor is not the one who was on trial. It is the case in which Breonna Taylor was murdered. And the verdict comes acquitted. And people start to cry out, we don't just need to abolish the police and prison system. We need to abolish a system that would allow the killing of Breonna Taylor and the acquittal of the officers involved, right? So now we're talking about system abolition. And when we're talking about system abolition, what we're talking about is actually just supporting a process that is already naturally happening, the collapse of our current system as we make way for something else. So this idea of abolition is actually a very old idea. Many have argued that the abolition of the carceral system, the abolition of our current capitalist white supremacist system is really just finally finishing the unfinished project of abolishing slavery. That was only negatively abolished, that in fact, slavery was allowed to continue through the prison system in particular, you know, and that in fact, this entire carceral state that we've set up is part of the slave labor model, this way of thinking of particular people as being inherently valuable and others being not valuable. And those who are not valuable are disappeared, removed, right? As part of fueling settler expansion and colonialism and imperialism and all of these things. So now we take care of each other becomes this shaping of like, oh, we actually are taking care of our ancestors by continuing this work. By pushing for abolition, we're finishing their work so that they can finally get to rest. Oh, and we're also taking care of our great-grandchildren because our great-grandchildren are going to finally be born free from slavery. So we're actually taking care, again, of 3 generations behind and 3 generations forward. So we take care of each other, starts to change and shift as we go through this year like this year is like no other year. We are in a period of systems reorganization, of rapid reorganization and rapid restructuring of our society as part of the natural phase of its life cycle, influenced by outside factors like COVID-19, like the push for abolition. All of these things are influencing our current reality of being in a system that is in a period of rapid change and rapid reorganization. We are in the most fertile of grounds. So Toni Cade Bambara said in the 1980s that she was really interested in creating irresistible revolutions. So she said that the role of the artist from the oppressed community or from oppressed communities is to make the revolution irresistible. That our work as people who came from that particular community is to make revolution seem so possible that how could we not push for it? And she said that she does that by attempting to celebrate our victories, but also to sort of recognize the reality of our situation. And as an artist and as an activist, I've been very interested in this idea of irresistible revolutions in conjunction with this idea of a life cycle, right? If we can explain this idea of a system going through a natural phase of reorganization, we can get people excited about what that reorganization is going to look like. Because if it's going to happen anyways, why not get involved in touching change, as Octavia said through Lauren and Lumina in her book? Let's touch and shape what this reorganization is going to look like. If new plants are going to grow on the forest floor, can we decide what the garden is? Can we decide what those plants are? Which trees grow? What is this world that we're trying to build? What is it going to look like? How can we all be involved in shaping that and building that together? Right? So this is a really exciting moment that we find ourselves in October of 2020, in the last quarter of what is perhaps one of the most challenging years that we've faced, in recent history, where we are in a moment of revolution. We are in a moment of irresistible revolutions where, for a variety of reasons, in part because people have had time in ways that they don't normally have because of capitalism, and in part because they've had, they've become politicized by all of this incredible learning and teaching that has been put out online right now, that shows that there are possible ways of moving forward, and shaping and changing the world. So to just say, this is a moment where we can turn to the past, where we can remember the Adinkra symbol of Sankofa that comes from the Ashanti people in Ghana and West Africa, this idea of learning from our past, this idea of going back and picking up what has been forgotten. We can go to speculative fiction and we can look forward 20, 30, 40, 100 years into our future and start to imagine what kind of world we want to live in. We can turn to artists from the communities who have been traditionally marginalized and say, what is this irresistible revolution that you're asking me to get involved in? And we can remember that ourselves as activists, that we are speculative fiction authors because we are daring to dream that another world is possible. I would ask that everybody start their day with centering care. And part of what that care could look like would be writing down on the back of a napkin or whatever you have available while you're drinking your morning coffee, a short story about the future. Write one every day. Imagine and dream what might be possible. When people ask you about what kind of world you want to emerge from COVID into, what does care look like in that future? What do disabled, deaf, and mad people, what are our roles in your future society that you're imagining? What are the seeds that you're hoping germinate in that cycle of death, decay, germination, nourishment that I started with that drawing that I would never have known would become so significant in my life? But this life cycle, this period that we're in fertile ground, what are you planting? And write about it and draw about it and just be creative in this moment. We are going to witness probably more change as the days and the months wear on. We still have another quarter to go in this 2020. And I know that last summer, not the summer that just passed, but the summer of 2019, they were saying because of climate change, we actually only had a few good years left. Well, we're already 18 months later from that. So we know that there will be dramatic changes that are going to continue to come and continue to come and to continue to come. And so now is the moment to do what Octavia was encouraging of us in 1992, when she said it is time to touch change, but also to remember that everything that you change changes you, right? So this is a moment to not only transform our society and to transform the way that we interact with each other, but to transform the way that we interact with ourselves and that we care for ourselves and that we center our support and our care. One of the beautiful things about this moment is that we can take leadership from disability communities because we've been at the forefront of meeting online and doing stuff at home. And, we've been doing that for a while because of an ableist society. society. So we can also borrow from disability communities this idea of cripping our timeline, slowing down, napping more, resting more. You know, that beautiful group, the Nap Ministry on Instagram, that was encouraging people to nap as part of our reparations, as part of our resolution of this capitalist society. Now is the time to center care more than ever. I believe, as Asada Shakur tells us, that we will win. I believe that we will make it to a future that is freer than the one that we are currently in now. I believe that we will get to a place where we all have self-determination. I believe that we will live in a future that is accessible. I know that Black and Indigenous people will survive, and as the Combahee River Collective told us in 1971, that would mean that everybody has. That in fact, if we make the world safer for the most marginalized, we're making it safer for everyone. So Black and Indigenous people will live in our beautiful future, and they will have survived, and thus we will all have survived. We are going to heal this planet. We are going to find ways to live in relation with all living beings on this planet. Now is the time to get involved. Now is the time to dream. Now is the time to write and to draw and to cover every surface with your imaginings of a future, because this is the most fertile ground, the ground that we are currently, on this occupied territory. This is a fertile moment for revolutionary action and revolutionary change. So in the words of my ancestors, all power to the people. And thank you so much for having me here today.